What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero, because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, hour number 2. We're going to close the phone lines for a while here because I really got a lot of news I need to get through here. Now then, turning over to Syria. A lot of interesting things starting to happen in Syria. Apparently the Tiger forces have prevailed against ISIS in Aleppo, making huge gains there. The Syrian government troops have taken back the Damascus-Palmyra road for the first time since this war began. That is a major, major communication path. If you look at a map of Syria, and you'll see all these maps out there about here is ISIS, and here are the U.S.-backed moderates, and here's the Turkish forces, and here are the Syrian forces. Forget about the volume of the map. Much of what ISIS, in theory, controls is just empty desert. You need to look at the lines of communication, because controlling those lines of communication is what determines who is really winning and losing the wars, and that's why this is an important story. Another story coming out of Syria Direct, U.S.-backed rebels losing territory in East Syrian desert to the regime. Things are happening very, very rapidly over there. Hasht al-Sha'abi reaches the northern Syria border. And control of those borders is very, very important as well. Those are the transit points to get material, men, supplies in and out of the country. The U.S. and Britain have been forced to withdraw some of their forces from the Al-Tanf border crossing in southern Syria and moving them back into Jordan. So, needless to say, the U.S. government is now worried about the Syrian army's rapid advances toward the borders with Iraq and Jordan because, gosh darn it, that's where we're going to carve out the new Kurdistan. How dare they do it? And you want to talk about the arrogance of power. The U.S.-led coalition is now calling on pro-Assad forces to leave the Syrian-Iraq border. They basically dropped a bunch of pamphlets all over the pro-Assad forces saying, get on out of here, you don't have a right to be here, if you threaten the people we're supporting, we will attack you. And the response from the Syrian army bordered on laughter, especially that part about you have no right to be there. Hey, it's our country, and you are not welcome here. You don't have permission to be here. But what we're seeing is a rapid escalation at that Syrian-Iraq border, which could lead to a standoff between U.S. Special Forces and Syria's Arab army. So it's getting very, very hot, especially around Al-Tanf. That's the new hotspot. Now, over in Iraq, Secretary General of Iraq's Badr organization, Hadi al-Amiri, announced that Hasht al-Sha'abi, which is their popular mobilization force, refuses to let the U.S. Army to take control over even a single inch of Iraq's borders with Syria. All of a sudden, Iraq and Syria share a common agenda. We are going to take care of our borders ourselves. And apparently, Iraq's paramilitary is also advancing toward the Syrian border. Try and clean out all these U.S.-backed forces or ISIS, whoever's there. So it looks like there is a change in the dynamic there. Now, France is now preparing a pro-Al-Qaeda intervention in Syria. France is going to go on into Syria, and they're going to bomb the Syrian forces in support of Al-Qaeda. This despite all these terror attacks that are happening inside France right now. Doesn't really seem to make a huge amount of sense anywhere. Meanwhile, the European Union has decided to extend their sanctions against Assad's regime for an additional year because of the repression of civilians. Oh my goodness, they're repressing their civilians. You want to talk about repressed civilians? Come to the United States of America. They've all but shredded the Bill of Rights. Now, here's the bottom line. The United States of America does not have Syria's permission to be in Syria. Syria did not invite them, does not want them. The U.S. keeps going into Syria. They've got boots on the ground, U.S. Special Forces. They're flying air missions which they claim are against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but seem to hit Syrian critical economic and military infrastructure. All of this is illegal under international law. It's illegal under U.S. law. There's no congressional declaration of a war against Syria. There is no UN Security Council resolution authorizing any of this. This is just the United States as aggressor in yet another country. Now, Moscow is expressing concern over the fact that the U.S. government is now issuing threats against Syria's armed forces. We're not talking ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We're talking the government of the United States of America's military is threatening the government of Syria's military inside Syria. And apparently it's all, again, it's focusing on that Al-Tanaf, on the border between Syria and Iraq. That's the new hotspot. Keeping an eye on that one. We're going to be doing a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Now, Mad Dog Mattis is out there saying that despite the threats by the U.S. against Syria's forces, that really we're just focused on the annihilation of ISIS. And, yeah, there's been a lot of civilian casualties. It's just a fact of life we're all going to have to accept. Yes, it's terrible, but just get used to it. The U.S. government is going to be killing civilians in all these countries they're trying to invade. And it's really kind of weird to see, because civilian deaths are a fact of life when the U.S. are causing them. But boy, if it's Russia and Syria killing civilians, oh my goodness, look what they did at Idlib. Look what the Russians are doing. It's horrible, all those dead civilians. What about the civilians the U.S. are killing? The U.S. is killing more civilians than Russia is. Well, that's just a fact of life. If you're a loyal American, you won't see the dead civilians we killed. You'll only see the dead civilians the Russians and Assyrians killed. Proving once again it is a wild card in this game, Turkey is now refusing to grant Germans access to the Incirlik air base. There's been a war of words building between Turkey and Germany, with Germany saying they're just going to pull out of Incirlik completely. Turkey is saying good riddance, goodbye. And that, of course, will require Germany to find some other friendly air base in the region to take part in their bombing of Syria's infrastructure. Now, there's been an alarming development that we need to pay attention to. And this story came out of Blacklisted News. Actually, it's been in a couple of different places. Shifting the blame for 9/11. And basically what it is, as you know, there was this ridiculous lawsuit that said Iran is responsible for 9/11, therefore the families of the victims of 9/11 can sue Iran for compensation. It was a true finding by the court. Now, true finding is when the judge says, we think this is what happened, and we don't have to show you any proof because, after all, I'm a judge. Which, by the way, is not in the Constitution. And so now they're trying to take the existence of this lawsuit to basically start building a case in the minds of the American people that Iran really was behind 9/11 all this time. Oh, yes, we were wrong to say that if Afghanistan did 9/11 and bombed their country to rubble. Yes, we were wrong to say that Iraq was behind 9/11 and bombed their country to rubble. But you can trust us now when we tell you that Iran was behind 9/11. So they're getting ready to dust off 9/11. There's been rumblings of trying to blame Saudi Arabia for it. And Saudi Arabia may have been involved as a cooperating with U.S. intelligence agencies, but they certainly did not initiate it for reasons we've talked about many, many times before. So now it's Iran. Next, they're going to say that Russia had something to do with 9/11. China had something to do with 9/11. It's their one-stop excuse. Oh, where we've now got new evidence that this country was involved in 9/11, therefore we have to go bomb them. Apparently, the Israeli cabinet decided to hold a meeting in the tunnels underneath the Al-Aqsa compound. Needless to say, the Palestinians are saying this is clearly a provocation, and yes, it is. It's symbolizing how Israel wants Jerusalem as their capital, including the Temple Mount. And if you've ever seen documentaries about those tunnels underneath that platform, they're not comfortable. It's not a good place to be holding a meeting. It was done to basically mark their turf. Now, here's an article that came out of Aleppo News that makes a very, very valid point. By definition, an aggressor cannot act in defense. And they're taking Israel to task for always explaining the bombings of Gaza and the West Bank by saying they're acting in defense of their country. No, they're not. They're going into other people's countries. And they set up a rather interesting little metaphor that if the United States annexed, occupied, and started building illegal settlements in Cuba, the U.S. does not have a right to claim it is defending itself when the Cubans act against U.S. aggression. International law sets a clear model for the dynamics of the situation. The country that is moving into somebody else's country is the aggressor. The country being moved into is the defender. And that applies to the United States versus Cuba or any of these other countries the U.S. is invading, and it certainly applies to Israel and Palestine. If you look at the maps of Israel from its founding to today, you see constant expansion, constant acquisition of other people's territory. Israel is the aggressor. The United States is the aggressor. The other countries are defending themselves, and they have every legal and moral right to do so, including North Korea. Now, the U.S. now has 3 carrier battle groups off the coast of North Korea, the Carl Vinson, the Nimitz, and the Ronald Reagan, the only carrier that glows in the dark. And North Korea is clearly accelerating their preparations to defend themselves against attack. Apparently, they had a successful test of a new anti-aircraft artillery piece that has now been ordered into production, and they've tested another ballistic missile. Now, there's a story that came out over the weekend, and I'm going to stress up front, there is no confirmation for it yet. But I feel it's worth a mention. This is coming out of Novorossiya. Apparently, SEAL Team 6 had been infiltrated into North Korea using the USS Michigan. Now, we talked about the Michigan before. The USS Michigan is a converted Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. It's been converted to what's called a guided missile submarine, where they take the 24 tubes that held the Trident missiles. 2 of them were converted to lockout chambers for divers for covert missions, and the remaining 22 tubes have multiple vertical launch tubes with either standard or Tomahawk cruise missiles in them. It carries one heck of a wallop, and it too is off the coast of North Korea. So the South Korean news had reported on how the USS Michigan had been up along the coast of North Korea. Obviously, the U.S. government doesn't say where those things are going. But apparently, the reports are, coming out of Novorossiya, is there was a SEAL Team 6 in North Korea, apparently in company with their South Korean counterparts, elite forces, on a reconnaissance mission with intimations of possibly an attempt at an assassination of Kim Jong-un. Apparently, they quite by accident stumbled into a major patrol, and they got into trouble and were actually forced to break radio silence in order to request assistance. So it was a botched mission. It went horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. And we'll wait to see if North Korea has anything to say about it. Obviously, the U.S. is staying silent about all of this, but it wasn't all that long ago they were talking about a decapitation mission against Kim Jong-un. Now, down in South Korea, their President Moon Jae-in is he's furious. Apparently, the United States deployed 4 additional THAAD missile launchers to South Korea, and President Moon Jae-in was pretty much the last one to know. And he's out there saying, no, the United States does not have our permission to be putting these weapons on our soil. We want them to take all their weapons out. And so President Moon Jae-in has ordered the legislature to start considering legislation to say, U.S. go home, Yankee go home. North Korea is accusing the U.S. of more provocation by sending B-1B Lancer bombers to Seoul. And yes, that's exactly what it is. And upping the ante still further, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in is now saying it's time for a summit with North Korea. He wants to call a meeting, face-to-face, to try and settle this down. Now, obviously, the United States is not going to want this to happen. So, Moon Jae-in, please make sure you're wearing your Kevlar undies, because presidents of nations that do not go along with the U.S. war agenda have a bad habit of falling over dead. Now, the House of Representatives passed a new bill called the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act of 2016. It's now going to the Senate. Russia is saying this basically amounts to an act of war, because among its other provisions is Section 104. This part of the bill says the U.S. now has inspection authority over shipping ports beyond the Korean Peninsula, specifically ports in China, Russia, Syria, and Iran. And I can see why Russia is upset. The U.S. Congress has no authority under the international law to demand inspections inside foreign sovereign territory. They can seek permission by treaty and diplomatically, let's be nice and make an agreement. But for the Congress to come on out and simply arbitrarily declare that they have authority over these ports in these other countries to have inspections is absolutely ludicrous. Meanwhile, down in the Philippines, it looks like the U.S. is using ISIS to try and take down the government of President Duterte, who refuses to go along with treating drug dealers and drug smugglers with kid gloves. And apparently, it is now getting deadly. Apparently, the official death toll is at least 85. It's probably a lot higher than that. But again, using ISIS as a proxy to bring down a government and replace it with a U.S. proxy. Now, as you know, one of the big things that happened during Trump's tour of Europe is he went and he addressed NATO, and he said NATO has to start paying more of the costs of the alliance. Now, everybody in Europe has always been, eager to be part of NATO because the U.S. is picking up the bills. And being a member nation of NATO means you get all kinds of free stuff. You get tanks and jeeps and bullets and bombs and all kinds of cool stuff. Why wouldn't you want a membership, in a club that gives you all kinds of free things? And Trump is now saying, no, everybody needs to pay a fair share based on their gross domestic product, which means the U.S. would still be paying most of it, but not as much as they have been. And all of a sudden, these NATO member nations are saying, well, if we're not going to get the free stuff, and you're asking us to spend more money on military when we have serious domestic economic difficulties, it may be time for a rethink. And we're already hearing that some of the countries already in NATO are thinking they might be better off getting on out of it. So that may be a strain on that. Now, as you probably already heard, Manuel Noriega, the former leader of Panama, has died in prison, aged 83. Apparently, he was dealing with some serious illnesses and died during his latest treatment. Now, the interesting thing you need to remember, in the original article that they're talking about this in the New York Times, they're talking about that he was tied to drug trafficking in the 1980s. And then, of course, the U.S. invaded and took him out, put him in prison. Well, there's more behind that story. Because remember, in the 1980s, that was when the CIA was running guns down to Nicaragua and bringing cocaine back. And one of the transshipment points, the airports, was in Panama. And Noriega was part of that deal. Then, when Iran-Contra broke, he turned around and tried to blackmail George Bush, saying, unless you give me this and such kind of money, I will go public and say, yes, all this drug and gun running was going on, and we were all up to our neck in it. And George Bush was not going to be blackmailed, and that's why Panama was invaded, and Noriega was thrown in prison and kept away from the public and press until now, when he has finally passed away. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And as long as we're talking about tests of ICBM, today the U.S. military ran another test of their ICBM interceptor, and it was a successful test, which is good because they've had so many failures in the past. But again, we need to be cautious about saying, huzzah, huzzah, we have a working weapon system, because so many military tests tend to be fudged with. And again, I go back to that wonderful book and movie, The Pentagon Wars, about the development of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Now, obviously, in the case of today's test, the defenders firing the anti-ballistic missile weapon, they know when the target is coming in, where it's coming from, what flight path it's going to be on. And that's an advantage that a real attacking enemy is not going to be providing. Plus, we need to remember that the latest generation of Russian and Chinese MIRVs are maneuverable. They do not follow a predictable ballistic missile path. Now, they're making a big point that this ballistic missile intercept test is all about North Korea, and that is true. North Korea's nuclear weapons, reentry vehicles, are not maneuverable to the best of our knowledge. That's where we are on that. Let's turn to the economic news here, and to nobody's surprise, Budget Director Mick Mulvaney is saying that the debt ceiling will have to be raised. They're going to have to increase the borrowing cap. They just can't make their ends meet with all these hideously expensive weapons out there. And Paul Singer's Elliott Management is out there sounding a warning that the current bullish environment on Wall Street is all based on the expectation that Trump's pro-growth agenda is eventually going to succeed. And Paul Singer is saying if it stumbles, if the Fed raises rates, for example, it's going to trigger a major, major upset. There are so many points of vulnerability with our economy. Sooner or later, something has to let go, and all the freshly printed ink and paper isn't going to be able to stop it. Now, right now, over 100 million Americans are somehow dependent on the federal government. And it brings to mind a comment Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. And that's exactly what's wrong with it. For an economy to be healthy, the vast majority of the population must be engaged in productive economic activity. And by productive, I do not mean processing papers and sticking labels on things. I'm talking about manufacturing products other countries want to buy, or growing safe, healthy, organic agricultural produce that other countries want to buy. That's how you do it. You cannot make a prosperous economy just shaking the money back and forth and rigging the rules to make it grow magically. It doesn't work that way. It never, ever has. Now, we know why the government wants more people dependent on the government, because then they're easier to control. If you are dependent on the government for your next meal, you're not going to speak out against the wars, against the corruption. You're not going to question the official story on Seth Rich. We've actually had the government advertising for people to get onto food stamps. Come on over, we'll give you a card, you'll get your food stamps. It'll be wonderful. No, that's dependency. That's enforced dependency, and enforced dependency is a form of slavery. That's what King George III was doing to the American colonies. You were forced to be dependent on the Bank of England for currency borrowed at interest. You were forced to be dependent on the British East India Company for your tea and various other goods. You were forced to buy all your cloth and clothing from the knitting mills in Manchester and Leeds in order to maximize the profitability. The colonials were made dependent on those companies. They were not allowed to go on out and find perhaps less expensive, less costly sources for those same things. And that was a primary motive for the American Revolution. That's why it's called Independence Day. Not Freedom Day, not We Kicked the British Butt Day. Coming up a little more than a month on Independence Day, and it's time to remember what that really means. Being free from enforced dependence on politically favored corporations, banks, and businesses. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And at this point, there's an ugly reality we all need to look at. Assuming the United States economy and government does not collapse, we as a nation will be leaving a debt of $30 trillion to our grandchildren. Now, these grandchildren, who will be U.S. citizens by birth, will have never had a chance to vote on whether they will accept that debt. They're being made debt slaves before they're even conceived. Our generation is doing exactly the same thing. We've all been made debt slaves by that Federal Reserve. We never had a chance to vote on that. We never had a chance on whether we wanted to surrender the constitutional monetary system this nation was founded on in favor of privatization of the economy for profit. Why are we obligated to go along with something that we ourselves have never had a chance to vote on? That's an important question in a supposed democratic society. Now, as you know, last week we had Ellen Brown on the show, and one of the revelations she shared with us is that when you go to the store and you buy a product, a bottle of water, 40% of the price of that product on the shelf is the accumulated interest paid to the bank along the entire production, delivery, supply chain, distribution path. 40%. Another statistic I heard is that the accumulated hidden taxes on the production of the product amount to another 30%. And that's before the sales taxes apply. And then we wonder why the products that we spend so much money on turn out to be so cheaply made or poor quality, filled with fillers and chemical additives. Too much of the economic activity of the people is being siphoned off by taxes and banker interest. And that's why other countries don't want to buy our products, because they are overpriced and poor quality. Now, Donald Trump, considering that he's a businessman, he went on out and he did something that I'm having a real problem with. Apparently, Trump is slamming Germany for selling millions of cars in the United States and saying, we will stop this. Well, yes, he's being protectionist. But here's what's going on. Germany makes very good cars. So does Japan. I love Hondas. People want to buy very good cars. That's how commerce is supposed to work. If Trump wants Germany or Japan to sell fewer cars in the United States of America, then America's automotive industry has to be overhauled and revamped and made competitive. And instead, Trump has hit the easy button of protectionism. Protectionism is a red warning flag of an economy in decline. Now, Russia and Iran have signed off on an oil for goods barter deal. Iran is going to send Russia oil. Russia is going to send Iran whatever Iran wants for it as a direct swap trade. They're not going through the electronic banking system. They're not going through the petrodollar. There are no sanctions on barter and trade. And it's another sign of a world that is rejecting U.S. hegemonic domination of the global economy. Now, over in Italy, as you know, they're in serious economic trouble. Their banks are in a real mess. And despite that, Italy is now refusing any bail-ins from outside, probably because they've seen what that did to Greece. They're saying, we're going to fix this ourselves internally, stay the heck out. Because everything that is done from outside, from the IMF, from the ECB, it's just another loan. It just plunges the nation further and more hopelessly into debt, just as we have seen in Greece and Cyprus. And Italy says no. Now, we had a caller on the line earlier who was talking about Bitcoin and how, oh, I wish I'd bought Bitcoin when it was whatever it was back then. And it was soaring up high. And last week I was saying it feels like it's being bubbled up, it's being manipulated. And any virtual currency or imaginary currency that is not tied to a commodity base can be manipulated in this way. And apparently there was a major drop in Bitcoin. And according to Natural News, they're saying that Bitcoin has moved into the pump and dump phase. And the Bitcoin propagandists are out there saying that, Bitcoin is still fine. Keep on buying. Keep on buying. They've turned it into a Ponzi scheme. Those who got out early made money. Those who did not, those who are being convinced to stay in Bitcoin, you're going to take a bath. Now, over in Great Britain, the furor over Brexit is continuing, with Brussels imposing ever more stringent demands on the soft Brexit, including continuance of the open borders, acceptance of refugees, Brussels' control over parts of Britain's economy, making the soft Brexit a Brexit in name only, along with, of course, this ever skyrocketing demand for money from Great Britain as a divorce payment, none of which is actually in Article 50 of the European Union Agreement. And so Theresa May is now saying it's time to talk hard Brexit. Put up the fences on the Channel Tunnel, just cut the computer lines, just cut it off right now. No talks, no discussion, hard Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn is still out there pushing that there has to be a deal with the EU to leave. So this is leading to a big faction fight. I think probably the majority of the British people are ready for a hard Brexit, because they're seeing all this delay tactic, negotiation, demand for money, demand for concessions, as just Brussels trying to reassert their control over sovereign Great Britain, and I think the British people are really fed up. Italy has signed an agreement with Libya, Chad, and Niger to limit the influx of migrants. See, all these human smugglers that are working across the Mediterranean, technically under international law, when you find a refugee floating in the ocean, you're supposed to take them to the nearest port. They don't. They drop them off in Italy. And Italy is really feeling the pressure from the influx of migrants, and now they're signing an agreement saying, no, we're not going to take any more. And this is in defiance of the European Union, which is saying, yes, you will take all the refugees we want. Now, Poland and Brussels are in a standoff over this very issue. And Poland is saying that they're going to take this matter to court because they can't take in any more migrants. It is a strain on their already strained social system. It has led to massive increases in crime, especially violent crime, seeing it all over Europe, Germany, especially in Sweden. And even Germany is starting to talk more nationalistic. Amazingly enough, for all of her allegiance to the New World Order and globalism, Angela Merkel is saying Europe can no longer rely on the US or UK and must fight for its own destiny. So now they're out there talking about a new isolated Europe. Meanwhile, a leading economist in Brussels is saying that Jean-Claude Juncker and Angela Merkel's vision of an expanding European project is doomed, precisely because it has that built-in self-destruct device called the European Central Bank, which, like the Federal Reserve, by design creates more debt than money with which to pay the debt until the debt starts taking the whole system down. And that's what we're seeing happen right now. A right-wing National Front Party member in an interview in Sputnik is saying that the German economy is thriving at the expense of the other EU states. I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate. Up until the Brexit, Germany and Great Britain bore the burden of the economic hardship of the EU as a whole. But it can be understood if the people of Germany, whose labor and technology produce a good gross domestic product, might want to keep more of that at home to benefit themselves. The same motivation that led to the Brexit. You know, we've built our little country. It's doing very well. We have manufacturing. We have agriculture. You know, we want to do better for our next generation. We built this nation and its wealth and its heritage and its culture as our legacy to the next generation. No, you may not take that away from us. So we're seeing splits and fractures all over the European Union right now. Apparently, the G7 leaders, during their meeting, out of concerns for security, have asked for the migrant boats to be stopped. Can you see the hypocrisy in that? The G7 leaders, oh, we don't want the migrants around us. Could be a problem, could be a problem. But for you ordinary people, just welcome them in, give them a big, wet, sloppy kiss, and when you come down with a rare disease, it's good for the medical industrial complex here. Out in Los Angeles, the federal government is starting to enforce the immigration laws. They nabbed 200 illegal immigrants, and we are seeing a decline in the number of illegal refugees coming across the border. So that part of Trump's border agenda is starting to work. But he's facing opposition from within his own government. This is a story that came out of the Conservative Tribune. And they, in turn, are quoting the New York Times, saying that the State Department, on their own authority, has lifted the restrictions on the number of refugees allowed to enter in the United States that flies in the face of Trump's campaign promises to voters. Apparently, in an email sent just days ago, a State Department official named Jennifer L. Smith quietly told private agencies involved in refugee assistance that foreigners can now enter the country unconstrained by the weekly quotas now in place. In other words, this Jennifer Smith is saying, ignore the quota system, just pull them on in as fast as you can. Now, this story actually made the corporate media. And apparently down in Austin, Texas, the legislature was meeting, talking about immigration, and apparently there was this big tiff getting into between two of the representatives, Rinaldi and Navarez. And apparently there was a huge protest out front with people holding signs proclaiming, I'm an illegal immigrant, I have a right to stay here. So Rinaldi basically called the Immigration Customs Enforcement. There's a bunch of illegal immigrants all in one lump out in front. Go get them. And apparently when Navarez found out about it, he literally lost his cool. On the floor of the legislature, tried to beat Rinaldi up and then threatened his life. Literally said that he was going to find him in the parking lot and kill him, which is going to be a trick. Rinaldi has a concealed handgun license. But I mean, this shows you how badly this open borders issue is being driven to where it's leading to legislators threatening each other on the floor. We could see a civil war in this country from all of these fanatics pushing their agenda and thinking that they're right and everybody else has to be wrong. Now, over in the universities, as you know, the liberal agenda, the snowflakes, are out there trying to sell this idea that those who are doing poorly in their grades are somehow being cheated by the white privilege or whatever. And apparently, according to this story over an Investment Watch blog, apparently liberal students who are getting high grades are now asking the school administrators to sort of redistribute the wealth of high grades to the lower GPA students. I'm sorry, grades are not a commodity. It is a measurement of academic achievement. And if you do this, it completely undermines the whole idea of having grades in a GPA. And if you do that, on what basis will potential employers decide who and who not to hire? The whole advantage of having those high grades in your college education, assuming you have an actual degree that's useful someplace, is to get to the head of the job line and say, I want that job. I had good grades. I can do the job. And then the employer says, I have no idea if you got the grades because you earned them or because somebody transferred them over to you for some liberal cause. We're seeing virtually every institution in this country undermined in terms of what we're supposed to think about them. Good grades don't mean today what good grades used to mean before. It really is getting kind of silly out there. Alrighty, let's see. Let's talk about the drug war. And we know that the war on drugs in this country is really the war on the competition's drugs. but there was a story that came out, Patriot Rising, about a drug cop who spent 14 years undercover going public and saying that it isn't working. The drug war and the illegal drug traffic are just increasing crime and violence. And he says everything the police are trying to do only exacerbate the drug-related crime. It's time for a new approach. Now, in countries that have decriminalized drugs, those crime problems go away. There's no more profit motive. But drugs are kept illegal in this country to keep them profitable. It's a replay of what happened during Prohibition, where the rum runners worked to keep alcohol illegal as long as possible to maximize the money they made from their illegal trade. And we're seeing it all over again in this country. Now, more and more, we're seeing a lot of states are pushing back against marijuana prohibition, both for its revenue-generating capability, the fact that it's actually less harmful than tobacco or alcohol, and it does have legitimate medicinal uses. But the entrenched corporate establishment, big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma, they all want it to go away to protect their bottom line. We're going to take another break for commercials. Back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, as you know, one of the big problems that we're dealing with in terms of the damage caused by a lot of modern pharmaceuticals is that in many cases, the pharmaceutical industries are protected by law. Certainly that's true in the case of the vaccines. You have to go through the Vaccine Injury Court. But it turns out there's now another weapon that's surfacing, and it's called a shareholder lawsuit. And apparently more and more of the shareholders of these pharmaceutical companies, when they make a major mess up about one of their medications that leads to losses, they're starting to file lawsuits themselves. And there is no law that shields a corporation from lawsuits by their own stockholders. Now, following the wake of new state restrictions, Planned Parenthood is going to close 4 of their clinics in Iowa. And basically, Planned Parenthood is back in the news. Apparently, there have been a couple more embarrassing videos that surfaced about it. And so over in Iowa, Governor Terry Branstad signed a Health and Human Services budget that discontinued the state's federal Medicaid family planning waiver and replaced it with a state program that excludes any clinic that offers abortions. Now, of course, the pro-abortionists are going to be up in arms and screaming, our body, our right, so forth and so on. And again, it's a complex issue. I concede there are times and circumstances when abortion is necessary and justified. I certainly do not agree with it being used as retroactive birth control by adults who are just being careless in their sexual behavior. It's what Planned Parenthood was doing with the parts that I think has most people appalled. We're going to take a phone call now. Andrea in Oklahoma. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Aloha?
Aloha.
Yes. I was calling about, you had said they were going to start rehashing 9/11, and I hope that they will bring up the idea that they sent back to Israel the dancing Jews that were supposedly filming the whole thing before it ever took place.
Okay, Andrea, they're bringing up 9/11 again. At least the corporate media and the government, they're bringing up 9/11 again to try and now sell the idea that Iran was behind it. And obviously, in the independent media, we'll bring all of that other stuff about 9/11 up again. But again, like trying to blame Saudi Arabia for 9/11, it doesn't make sense Iran would do something like that.
Yeah, and what about the truck that was full of bombs that was going to the tunnel that was caught?
Yeah.
And what about Larry Silverstein, the only person that would buy the Will Train Center that was full of the asbestos? Nobody else would buy the place because they were going to be out millions and millions of dollars. And then he made a killing on the insurance. And it just goes on. And then when you say that that our children are going to be responsible or for paying all this debt back, that they can just print money out of thin air, and we need to make our children very aware of what they're doing with just printing money out of thin air. Oh, you still there?
We do. Andrea, got to let you go. Got to take a station identification break. We'll be right back.